Hello, everyone, and welcome to the panel Amplifying Voices on Turtle Island and Intersectional Caucus. Thank you for joining us for the panel AfroIndigeneity, Stolen Bodies on Stolen Lands. My name is Shayna Calix, and I'm the Director of Community Relations and a board member of Black Lives Matter Sudbury. Before we get started with this panel, we would like to acknowledge that BLM Sudbury is located in Swakamock. They are known as Sudbury. The land on which we learn, work, and live is located on the traditional lands of the Atitmashing and the Shinabek and the Wampanoag First Nation in the Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory. We'd also like to recognize the presence and important contributions of Métis people in the community and on this land. Here at Black Lives Matter Sudbury, we recognize that reconciliation does not begin and end with a simple land acknowledgement. We must work to actively decolonize spaces and uplift Indigenous ways of learning and knowing. In addition, we must all aid in the ongoing battle for Indigenous sovereignty, access to clean drinking water, and seek justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women and Two-Spirit individuals. Furthermore, we want to acknowledge that February marks Black History Month. While oppression, discrimination, and systemic injustices cannot be diminished to just 1 month a year, it is important to recognize this time as an opportunity to educate yourself, your family, and your friends on the historic contributions of Black communities in Turtle Island. We'd also like to take a moment to thank our conference sponsors. It is because of their generosity that we have been able to thrive and present important programming like this caucus within our northern community. Let's remind everyone that biographies of our panel participants and a full list of our conference sponsors can be found on our website, www.blmsudbury.ca. We are pleased to offer ASL interpretation for each panel, provided by the Interprétation Signes et Paroles, ISEP. Following this panel, all attendees will receive a feedback survey that can be filled out for a chance to win a prize pack of items, including the caucus logo designed by Raven DeBosky. This logo expresses a power and connection among marginalized individuals across Turtle Island. The art depicts the interconnection between humanity and nature, and the woodland stylization and vivid colors aim to celebrate solidarity among Indigenous and Black communities. Our moderator for this panel is Isaac Vaillancourt, one of the co-founders and board members of Black Lives Matter Sudbury. Our panel consists of Tasha B, Kristen Murray, Aja C, and Raven Wings. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for your participation. And without further ado, here's your moderator, Isaac Vaillancourt.
Thank you, Shayna, for the introduction and for that land acknowledgement highlighting action. So hello, everyone. My name is Isaac, and I will be the moderator for today's discussion. It's really nice seeing some familiar faces on this call today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from you all about the experiences of being Afro-Indigenous in colonial Canada, as well as hearing about the ways in which settler-colonial systems continue to divide and harm marginalized groups. So today we'll start off with some discussion questions that we prepared for our panelists, and then towards the end, we'll be answering questions from the audience. So a reminder to please use that Q&A function, and we'll try our best to get to your question. So to start us off, I'd like to ask each panelist to share a bit about their background, where they're situated, and why they're a part of this conversation today. And Tasha, you're right beside me on my Zoom screen, so would you mind kicking it off?
Sure, I can do that. Ani Tanse, Kapemote Askiesco Nisakason, Neo-colonial, Ekwa Mr. Wasas, Ekwa Takaku, Nia Otsi, Nihiawa Squel, Niso Matehewan Isquel. I introduced myself in the lands of my maternal ancestors, which are Plains Cree. I'm situated in the Treaty 6 territory right now. And I acknowledge the ancestors that have got me to this point where I'm sitting in front of you today. I also acknowledge the ancestors in all of the lands that we are respectively situated in as panelists and as audience members. I belong to the Midewin Lodge, so I'm a second level Midewin practitioner. My lodges are out of Roseau River, Manitoba, and Wikwemkoong on Manitoulin Island. And that's a huge part of my identity. So I always acknowledge those places and those lodges as part of my home. I am a water walker as well, so I acknowledge the waters that are here in my ancestral territories, in addition to the waters that surround each of us as, again, as panelists and audience members. I was culturally raised as a Plains Cree woman. My mom, well, Plains Cree and Scottish Métis. I make the distinction because they're actually two kind of ancestral lineages for the Métis people, and that's Scottish and French. So on my mom's side, I was both, we have Scottish Métis and Plains Cree ancestry. My father is Bajan from Barbados, my late father. I didn't know him very well, so my mom brought me to my homelands when I was 2 years old. And so I grew up in the 70s, and so it was a tough existence, central Saskatchewan, small town Saskatchewan. I have a son and two granddaughters, and that too, as a kukum and an auntie, an Indigenous auntie, those are part of my identities as well. But yeah, so culturally I was raised as a Plains Cree woman, and it was a difficult time growing up in small town Saskatchewan. There were very few Black people in my inner circle, and in the town that I grew up in and on the reserves, it was usually just me. And so that, those early experiences really, really defined me and formed me and provided me with an element of resistance and strength. I'm an educator. I'm a professor in Indigenous studies. I'm affiliated with the University of Saskatchewan, the University of Windsor Indigenous Legal Orders Institute, Carleton University, and Queens and Kenjigawa. And I know I'm a busy lady, but yeah, so as an educator, that also informs me. I believe that part of my role always connects back to my community, and to the larger Indigenous community as well, and to the larger Black Indigenous community. I think that distinction, is a part of who we are as well. So I acknowledge both lines of my ancestors. And yeah, so I'm a kukum and an auntie, and that sense of responsibility is why I joined this panel today, because we have a whole new generation of Indigenous Black youth who are coming after us. And so for me, it's really important to lay those good tracks for them to follow. And I'm really happy to see my Anishinaabeg niece, Asia, who I've known Asia for many, many years. So it's really beautiful that we've got this kind of wide generational perspective that you're offering on this panel. So I'll just end there for now so we can hear from the others too. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Tasha, for that introduction and for explaining where you're situated and a bit about your story. Asia, you're up next. Would you like to introduce yourself? Tell us where you're situated and a bit about your background.
Hi, my name's Asia. I'm currently living in Kelowna, BC, which is Syilx Okanagan People's Territory. So I'm in a different province than everyone else, I think. I'm not sure if anyone else is from BC, but yeah, so I go to UBC Okanagan. I'm in my second year, and I'm studying international relations, which is very interesting and definitely encompasses a lot about what we're going to be talking about today. My dad is a political refugee from Mauritania. He came to originally Washington, D.C. in 1998. And my mom is an Anishinaabe. She's from Northern Ontario, and she's from Sioux Lookout, Ontario. So it's up north there in the cold. I originally grew up in Peterborough, Ontario, in Anishinaabe Haudenosaunee territory. And that's how I was raised with my mom on the land. I have a relationship with my dad, but we're not super close. But from what I do understand, his mom, my grandmother, her name is Kumba Betty Dia. She is from Fulani from Senegal, so she's Senegalese. And then my grandfather, my late grandfather who's passed, is Wolof from Mauritania as well, and their village is Tikan. Yeah, so I'm just studying on Silix Indigenous territory, and I am bringing my Anishinaabe upbringing into my African roots and living and learning on Indigenous land as I continue to do, and as I plan to continue to do for the next few years as I situate myself in my education somewhere. Not sure where that will be, but hopefully we'll see. I'm taking steps to broaden my path, so we'll see where that takes me. But yeah, Chimigwech.
Thank you so much, Asia, for that introduction. And next up on my screen, we have Raven.
Hello, everyone. I'm Raven Araya Wings. I'm excited to be in this conversation with all of you lovely folks today. I'm currently in a rehearsal process. So if you see people walking around and things moving around, that is what is happening today. I'm in a play called White Girls in Moccasins. It's a coming of age story from an Anishinaabe woman, and I'm playing her grandmother and a river spirit. And so it's very much part of my life practice, turning my art and to art to understand myself and my ancestry and my people, also embodying my own activism. So I was born on the island of Bermuda. My family come from the hunter-gatherers of Tanzania, as well as Mohawk Indigenous through my grandmother. And you know, there's such a rich history between the connections between my bloodlines, both as a descendant of abolitionists, as well as sort of understanding my purpose as a two-spirit person and trans woman. My work started through dance advocacy for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and two-spirit individuals, communities, marginalized communities, more specifically creating harm reduction, dance workshops and programs for folks to be able to tell their own stories, as well as platforms to express themselves the way that they want to and need to. So that is me in a nutshell. I'm also a co-founder of Black Lives Matter Canada, which I'm really proud of. It has been a journey of learning and getting in right relationships with the land, with people of this land, understanding our purpose. I stand, because my experience of growing up in Bermuda, Atlanta, Georgia, my family in the US, a lot of my experience growing up was of a Black experience. And that is why I stand in front of those movements. So just so that explains a little bit about me. And I will pass it off to the next person.
Thank you so much, Raven, for that. And I have tickets to that show. I'm very excited to watch that. And last but not least, Kristen, I'd love to hear about where you're coming from, where you're situated, and a bit about your background as well.
Hi, everyone. My spirit name is Sacred Eagle Woman, and I'm from the Bear Clan. So I am coming to everyone from Timmins, Ontario, which is the traditional territory of Matagami First Nation, which is Treaty 9 territory. So a little bit about myself. I was born and raised in Toronto, Jane and Finch area. We lived there for quite some time. And I think it was about that time that I learned I was Indigenous. I always thought, you know, my mom was white and my dad was Black, but never really, you know, taking into deep consideration really who my mom was until we had an assignment that was given to us where we had to dress as our culture. And, you know, my mom, she worked really hard at making this dress that was like cheesecloth stained with tea bags. So it was an interesting outfit. And then that's really when the story came out where she shared that she was Indigenous. And it was shortly after that time where we moved to her First Nation, which is Shaplo Cree First Nation, which is about 2 hours from here. So that transition from living in a big community of Toronto, Jane and Finch area, predominantly Black, to Chapleau, where me and my sister were the only people of color, was quite shocking. So, you know, our upbringing definitely took a transition as we moved there. So I'm a descendant of the first, one of the signatories to Treaty 9, as well as, you know, my great-great-grandfather was the first chief of Chapleau Cree First Nation. So I guess it's maybe natural that I'm a city councillor with the city of Timmins, just having that, you know, bloodline amongst us. So it's interesting how my life sort of took a turn to be where I am today, but it's really important that doing this work, because as I was campaigning and even current day, you know, to see young Black, Indigenous, or Black and Indigenous youth really feel like they can enter spaces and have conversations that, you know, they may not have felt able to prior to, is really important. I am a mom of 2 daughters who, since I became a counselor, really hold me to task. So that's fun. And I'm an equity lead in my profession. So although I'm a counselor, I still work full time. Unfortunately, it's only part-time counsel here. And yeah, I like to teach and share. And so I'm the first person of any ethnicity to be on Timmins City Council, which is quite groundbreaking for our community that's predominantly Caucasian. So it's that's a little bit about me, but I'm interested to have deep discussions with some of the other panelists. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you everyone for explaining where you're calling and for offering helpful context. I think now's a good time to jump into our first discussion question. So I was wondering if we could speak to the ways in which colonialism and racism continue to impact the lives of Black and Indigenous communities. Would anyone be interested in jumping off first for that question? How about I pass it over to Raven?
I will jump in. I was supposed to unmute. Thank you. It's a big question, right? Because colonization is so invasive and intrusive and violent and normalized, right? There's so many ways in which we exist in this time period that we're created to divide and to separate, to cause confusion, to lose a sense of self. All of these things are part of the experience of colonization. So as Afro-Indigenous person, we technically don't exist in this white supremacist colonization thing, even though we know that we do. And the ways that we do are powerful and necessary. But it breaks down to squashing our nuance and, you know, pushing up against that and having these conversations are necessary to decolonize, to reset, to make right the relationships to land and climate and oceans and waterways. You know, for me, within Black Lives Matter, we've always wanted folks to understand the history of this country, of how we got here, that it wasn't just sort of, we didn't just get to this place of 2020 uprisings and all those kind of things, and now 2022, that this is a long history of resistance, of conversation, of solidarity movements. When many people think of the Underground Railroad, for example, as I mentioned, I'm a descendant of enslaved Africans. That the Underground Railroad couldn't have happened without Indigenous support and solidarity and shelter and sharing our ways with each other, our dances, our movements, our culture, our love, and building our families together is the way that we resisted the constant threats of colonization. And I feel like I'm just gonna say that there is a large conversation that needs to happen with Indigenous communities around anti-Black racism and how we have those deep, necessary, very difficult, complicated conversations those of us who were stolen, brought to stolen land to build monuments to white supremacy, for example, and how we need to have conversations of healing, and it's not going to be easy, and to work through our conflicts with each other so that we build together, and build circles and ceremonies of safety.
Thank you, Raven, and thank you for touching on the historical and contemporary erasure of Black Indigenous communities. I think that's going to be a very important aspect of our conversation today. I don't want to pick on anyone, but I'm curious, Asia, what do you think about this question? And can you speak to the ways in which colonialism and racism continue to impact the lives of Black and Indigenous communities?
Yeah, so I also just want to clarify, I am not from, my people were not enslaved, my ancestors were not enslaved. So I just want to clarify, I don't want to situate myself as someone who has that, historical oppression when I don't, and I'm not going to claim that. So I don't have that lived experience, and I don't have those, oh, it's skipping my mind, sorry. Another thing I just want to address, I do have notes on my phone right beside me. I struggle with ADHD, I have a terrible memory. So if I'm looking over here and I'm looking down, I'm looking at notes because I cannot remember anything I want to say. So I just want to address that. But yeah, so just to address the question, I can't really speak from, the perspective of Black Indigenous communities, just because the community where I was raised, Peterborough, Ontario, the Indigenous community there, was not heavily involved with Black people. There wasn't a lot of Black people. If you've ever been to Peterborough, Ontario, there's not a lot. There's no Black people there. It was just me and Tasha for the most part, honestly. And so I can't really speak, but I think that just to speak to what Raven said, I really do agree. We really do need to have the conversation about anti-Black racism in Indigenous communities, because growing up in that community, it was something that I definitely struggled with, and definitely something that I came face to face with a lot. And I think that, just speaking from my own perspective again, colonialism is ongoing and it's structural now for me. I feel like I'm confronting colonization a lot more in the structured system, especially with being a university student. And so I think the union between AfroIndigeneity needs to be something that's at the forefront, just to open those conversations up and make places for people like me and students like me, and youth like me, because, growing up not ever really having that space is definitely something that it's limiting, and it's real, and it's something that, can really hold you back from your own, or at least for me personally, like holds you back from your own expression of indigeneity. I know it's something I really struggled with. And as much as that comes from Indigenous communities, it's from the structure, the colonial structure, and it's structural violence against both communities. And I think that, finding solidarity between both is gonna just, do great things for the Black community, and for people, like, Kristen, like who didn't know they were Indigenous till later in their life, opening up communities and spaces for people like us to, express ourselves and express our indigeneity while also being Black, and also dealing with, the complexities that come with being Black in the community, which is already enough, already a lot. And so when you add being an Indigenous person, being an Indigenous woman on top of that, it's just like, feels like you have all the structures of oppression coming down on you. And so I think that by opening up these spaces and having these conversations and opening up these communities, we're doing this, even this panel alone, we're opening up the space for youth like me. I mean, I guess I'm still considered a youth. I mean, I'm 19, so I guess I'm still considered a youth. I'll go for it. But, for people my age and younger, just to feel as though there's some sovereignty there between the two communities. Just, I mean, that's kind of my take on it. I mean, it continues to affect my life every day. It's a really complex intersection. And there's a lot that comes with it, but I think that just recognizing each other and saying that we're there, saying I'm Black and Indigenous too, and opening up those conversations, as I keep repeating, will be, the next step. But yeah.
Yes, thank you, Asia. And you mentioned so many great points, like recognizing the intersections that accompany these multidimensional identities, and also acknowledging how colonization is structured and embedded into everyday systems such as education, healthcare, policing, and so on and so forth. So Tasha or Kristen, would you like to add to the question of speaking to the experiences of colonialism and racism and how that impacts Black Indigenous communities?
Yeah, I'll go. I just want to track on a couple of things that that have already been that Asia and Raven brought up. I think colonization is heavily invested in ensuring that Black and Indigenous communities are separated. There's power in numbers, right? And so I think the anti-Black racism that's been cultivated within Indigenous communities is actually a part of that white supremacist tool, right? They want that separation to exist. And I think colonialism as an active force, right? And I'll go back to what Asia had indicated too, that those conversations need to occur, and that solidarity, I know we're kind of jumping to question 5, but that solidarity does need to occur, because in the face of the ongoing colonialism and the very real impacts that we're seeing from the earth and the waters reacting to the ways that we as humans have wrought devastation, there's more coming in the future. We're already dealing with COVID, the threat of a third world war. And so I think in the face of this uncertain future, colonialism is, again, it relies on us not having that power together, and it will do everything it can from our daily lives to the structural, from the microaggressions to the structural racism that we face. And again, there is a uniqueness being both Black and Indigenous, because I've actually experienced both. I've experienced anti-Black racism and I've experienced anti-Indigenous racism. And that's kind of, it goes both ways. And so those of us that are situated, as Asia indicated, in this complex intersection, we're impacted very, very uniquely. One of the things that I've noticed in my time as living as a Black Indigenous person, and again, I situate myself within my Plains Cree identity as well. I was not raised as a Black woman. I was culturally raised Cree, and so I exist still as a Black Indigenous woman. And I think part of that, one of the unique barriers that we face, is there's this weird exoticization of us that's so bizarre. It's still like, 50 years of living in this little Black Indigenous skin, and I'm still like, what is that? Like, there's almost a fetishization. And as Indigenous women, Black Indigenous women, and Black Indigenous Two-Spirit trans, I think, and not to take away from Black Indigenous men, and that's something else to future. Just to kind of segue, I always think that we need to hear from those Black Indigenous male voices too. We very seldom, I've never sat on a panel with a Black Indigenous man, because I think that conversation is important too. But those of us who are women and queer and Two-Spirit and identify as such, there's something very threatening from that white male gaze, and it's I'm still trying to make sense of it, and it impacts us in multiple, like not just on the day, like on the daily, whether we're talking about we walk into a store or we're inside of those institutions. There's something very threatening about who we are and who we represent, and the way that I track on that is because we do carry those ancestral lines, and we do represent this threat to the dominant status colonialist quo, right? And so that exoticization leads to a particular flavor of violence that's directed towards us as Black Indigenous women and Two-Spirit queer people, trans people. I think it's there's an element, it's always this mixture of like this attraction, but also this anger. And so it becomes really, really dangerous to exist in the spaces that we exist. And it can come from either spaces, right? So not only are we dealing with that violence from that white supremacist foundation, but it comes and it bleeds through our Black relatives and our Indigenous relatives. And so we're situated in this really, this really, I would say at times, really vulnerable space. But I think, again, that we need to recognize that colonialism as an active agent relies on us being separate. It does not want us to come together, within that sphere of being both Black Indigenous, but Black and Indigenous communities, because we represent that threat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tasha. You said so many amazing things, especially in terms of colonialism striving on keeping us apart. That's why conversations like today are so important and so precious. And Kristen, would you like to add anything to that question?
Yes, I was just enthralled with what Tasha was saying about the exoticism, because it's so true, and sometimes when people, first glance at us, they're not necessarily sure who we are or where we belong to. So there's this need to sort of guess. And I mean, I'm not going to go through the array of identities that I've been given. But I was nodding the whole time, just enthralled, because I haven't had very many experiences with Black and Indigenous people just from where I'm situated. So when I get to have these conversations, it's always amazing, because I feel like there's this relatedness that I don't always get from either Black or Indigenous. We are kind of like in this other space that exists. So I often say that I'm living I'm walking in three worlds, right? So, white mainstream society, but I also know how to navigate, Black as well as Indigenous spaces. So it's unique in that I've never felt that it was, a huge weight to bear, but kind of like a unique approach to seeing the world through a very, creative lens. So I do appreciate that. And I think, when we talk about colonization and how it continues to impact the lives, we see it in a lot of areas, why there are less Black and Indigenous people in spaces of, positions of power and whatnot. So that's, as a counselor, and I know that, my path here hasn't always been easy, and in my terms. So I think about, when we're put in these positions of power, or in these roles that we have, being supported throughout, and because we'll have those other forces sort of driving us down. So it's unique. So I'm just taking it all in. I did have a lot to say, and I had notes just like Aja. We can't necessarily remember everything we want to say, but I'm just thrilled about the conversation, because I feel like, that colonialism does exist in a lot of areas. Education, why isn't, I was never taught about Indigenous people while I was in school, let alone Black people. And the government just recently announced during Black History Month that that's something they were going to do, as, teach about Black history. And, it seems quite late to do so, considering Black people have been existing on this land for many, many years. But I guess it's a start to many things that the, province or government has to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. And we're just cognizant of time, because at the end we will have questions from the audience, but there are a few questions that we prepared that I think are really important and I'd really love to get to. So all of you have mentioned we're very much situated in this unique space, kind of walking through multiple worlds. So I guess the next question is, how do you navigate your multiple identities? And what does that entail in itself?
I can just jump right in. Blackness is powerful, is beautiful, it's bold. Indigeneity is sacred, it's honest, it's truthful. And being bridge people, the in-between people, we learn very quickly how to navigate it. It's a skill, it's a craft even. And some of us turned it into careers of performance and dance, storytelling in those ways. because I think that representation is so important. Being able to see ourselves, we each talked about that in like different ways. Being able to see ourselves and see our people and see people who have experiences that are different from us and similar to us, so that we can relate on more human levels. For me personally, I have always loved movement. And so that's what I turn to for safety. That's where I turn to for, it's my love language. And so it's what I share with my community, it's my mentees, and my mentors. And it's the way that I understand myself in activism, in abolition as well. And so, it allows me to understand who I am always. And so I know when I show up in this particular space that this is my offering. I know when I show up in this particular space that this is not my space to offer in that particular way. And so really having a multitude of ways to show up and be in a relationship with people. That's all activism is anyway, you know? It really just sharing and building relationships with each other. And so that's pretty much how I do it, and keep a circle of people around me and keep me accountable to these principles. And let me know with love and not guilt or shame or any of the colonial tools that were used to subjugate us, but loving me bigger, and so that I love bigger and understand myself more deeply. These are the ways that I feel like we take care of each other. There's a saying in Black activism that we save us, we take care of each other, we look out for each other, we keep each other safe. And so these are some of the ways that I have chosen to navigate the world we're in.
Thank you, Raven, so much for that response. And Kristen, what are your thoughts? How do you navigate your multiple identities, calling from Timmins, a predominantly white northern town?
Yeah, I think, if I'm being very honest, there was a struggle a while back, because when people see me, they see Blackness. Even though I'm fair skinned, that's immediately what's seen, right? They don't question whether or not I'm Indigenous. So, prior to me having a status card, I really would always, comment on, my mom's Indigenous and her family, and not necessarily really attach myself to being that because of these very colonized way of thinking about us, right? Blood quantum, you're not Native enough, so why are you calling yourself Native, kind of come into play. But I think when it comes to identity, I've really settled into who I am because I'm really rooted in Indigenous culture, but I grew up very Jamaican. So allowing those to sort of just really be my base and not necessarily focusing too much on what everyone else thinks that I should be when I show up to a space. I know I'm Black and I know I'm Indigenous, and I'm in the middle of those two intersectionalities, which is quite unique. So sometimes I show up a little with a little more attitude, and sometimes I show up with a little bit more kindness, depending on who I want to be that day. But at the same time, really rooted in culture. I've had the ability to spend a lot of time with elders in local community, which has been very grateful. And I think when you look at the medicine wheel too, you see all the different kinds of men who exist. So I get my back turned up sometimes when I see a medicine wheel that's blue, because I know that I'm not blue and I'm Black. And I think it's really important that that's honored, because that was a tool that we used historically. But as it relates to identity, sort of current day, I think being someone who's a member of the public has really allowed me to settle in, because I think people have really looked to me as motivation or inspiration, a lot of the younger ones, and you really have to be embedded in your concrete identity. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Kristen, for that. And Tasha, what are your thoughts on this? How do you navigate your multiple identities, and what are some nuances that come along with that?
Yes, I have always, until I didn't realize I was part Black until I actually went to school, and I was defined as such in similar fashion to Kristen, right? But I thought I was just Cree until I was 6 years old, because I didn't see any Black people. And, I remember going to school and this little white kid saying, "Oh, you're Black." And then I went running home, Mom, I'm Black. I was just crying. "Why didn't you tell me?" She's like, "Well, of course you are." Like it was just accepted. And so, I struggled initially with who I was as a Black Indigenous woman and claiming that Black ancestry, because the racism was so horrific towards me. And I think there was an element there was just an element of not wanting to be Black for the longest time. And it wasn't until I went to university and I was introduced to these phenomenal writers like Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks. And, it really shifted that sense of shame, right? I was ashamed because of the impact of violence and the racism. And so, as going into that and recognizing who I was, and then doing that work to reclaim those grandmothers and those grandfathers. And that's how I see it. The other thing I think to recognize when we're talking about our the multiplicity of identities is that each of us as Black Indigenous people, we come from very different spaces, right? And so there's no one kind of, just like there's no one Black experience or no one Indigenous experience, there's no one Black Indigenous experience, because, we've got these very lived experiences. And I navigate now, I lay claim to all those grandmothers and grandfathers from both, from both all of my ancestors, because I think, what they did to get me here, right? To have me here, I am those ancestors' dreams realized. I am who they thought about when they were, whether they were Plains Cree people going through those colonial efforts to destroy us, or in my Bajan ancestry, all my grandmothers were slaves, right? And so I think about that now, and I lay claim to all of my identities. One of the things that one of our lodge teachers by the name of Onabundise, or Jim Dumont, he says, Gije Minadu, or the creator, gave us the right to be. And I hold that, because we have the right to be who we are. And for those of us that are, come from these multi-ancestral lineages, we have the right to be, if I want to be fully and embrace that Plains Cree element, I can do that. I can step into that identity, but I can also step into my Bajan identity. And right. And so for me, it's a gift now. I see it as a gift, that I have the right to be who I am on any given day. And kind of like Kristen said, one day you're into the powwow, you're like jigging or dancing or singing, those Anishinaabeg songs or those Cree songs. And the next you're really embracing that Black identity. And so it can be difficult though again, because there's always that external kind of energy directed towards us, that makes us want to kind of pigeonhole us into one place, and we simply can't be, because we're such complex, beautiful people, right? So thank you.
Thank you, Tasha. And I think it's very important that you highlighted, it's not a monolithic experience, and having the right to be who you are is very special. Asia, is there anything that you'd like to add in terms of the navigating your multiple identities?
Yeah, I just want to say that I really resonate with everything that everyone has already said. And you guys did such a great job put it so beautifully. I hope one day I can be that articulate, because I just feel like I can't find the words like that, but great job. Love it. Yes, agree, snaps. But yeah, I mean, I personally, I grew up, like I said earlier, in Anishinaabe territory in Peterborough, Ontario. I spent cumulatively the most time there. I also spent a year in East Lansing, Michigan, and I lived in Victoria, BC for 5 years, and now I'm in Kelowna. So I've had to navigate a lot of different places, in this body, as a Black Indigenous person, in a lot of different demographics, like living in Ontario with all my Caucasian peers, and then living in Michigan and all of a sudden having all these Black people in my school, and then living in Victoria, and then having a lot of East Asian and Middle Eastern people in my school, and, you know, kind of just being exposed to all these different, you know, diversities and lack thereof has definitely something that, you know, put up a barrier for my expression and my self-identity, a lot of those things. And again, like, as I mentioned before, I think this is why we really need to open up those spaces like early on for youth, because it's really hard. It's continually hard, and it has been hard, and it will be hard, you know, to find myself and situate myself and, you know, be who I want to be that day. And I really resonate with what Kristen and with what all three of the panelists have already said, you know, with kind of having to situate yourself, and it kind of depends on the day. I mean, for me, I can definitely say that in my recent, more adult years, in my later teenage years, sorry, I'm just reminding myself how young I am. It's kind of funny, but but yeah, in my later years, I've definitely stepped more into my Black identity, because it's something that I'm more comfortable with, because every room I walk into, as Kristen said, I'm Black first. I'm Black first, and that's something that's been, you know, I've been very much, people tell me that, like, they know I'm Black and they expect me to be Black. And, you know, it's almost like out of a place of guilt where I'm like, okay, like, oh, am I Black enough? Like, oh, I'm not Black. Like I'm like, people are often shocked when I say that I'm half Black, half Indigenous. They're like, really? Like, your mom's not Black? And I'm like, no, like, she's not Black. People are often surprised because I'm pretty dark. And so that, you know, and this is kind of where we get into those complexities of, you know, colorism and how dark you are and things. But for me, it's been, I walk into the room and the first thing people, I'm Black. And especially, you know, my style expresses that, my facial features, my, you know, my look, like, I'm a Black person. And I've definitely stepped into that more in my recent years. But, you know, as a kid, being raised by my mom, who's actually in the Zoom. Hey mom, Wasayas and Christine C. I love to acknowledge her. That's my queen. She's the reason that I'm here. Hey girl. You know, being raised by her, and she was doing her degree throughout my whole childhood, and she just recently finished her PhD in Indigenous Studies at Trent University. Congrats. But, you know, being raised by her and being raised in that academic atmosphere with all the Indigenous people as a child, I was born Indigenous, and, you know, I'm really blessed to be born Indigenous, but also born Black. I never struggled with knowing either of those identities in my youth. But it was kind of just a matter of, you know, all the different places I've been shaping who I have stepped into, if that makes sense. You know, I found it a lot easier for me to navigate, to just embrace my Blackness, but also know my Indigeneity and be rooted in that. I've struggled with it a lot. Again, it's a structural system. I'm faced with it every single day, but I think situating myself in the Black community as a Black Indigenous person is, you know, opening those doors. Again, as I keep saying, opening those doors for the Black Indigenous people, because there needs to be people like us. There needs to be people like me who are, you know, situating ourselves in that group and making that space, because as Raven said, like, we're doing it for ourselves, we do it for each other. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Thank you so much, Asia. That was phenomenal. So we have 15 minutes left. So I'd like to ask one more question from our discussion question list, and then hopefully we'll be able to answer one question from the audience. So our next question is, we drew inspiration from our title from Cyrus Marcus Blair's phenomenal work, Stolen People. Thinking about this further, what comes to mind when thinking of stolen people on stolen land, and where are the interconnections that you see from this reality? And Raven, I know you have to head out soon, so I figured maybe you can start us off.
Sure, thank you. I love Cyrus. Cyrus is amazing. We talk all the time about displacement, you know, and who we would be if we were uninterrupted, uninterrupted peoples. You know, this conversation of theft, this conversation of being stolen, taken, for me means that my dreams got interrupted and reshaped and remodeled into ways of survival. And so many of us have spent our lifetimes running or fighting or, you know, dreaming or wishing or hoping or trying to get back to self. I find a lot of conversations that I'm in are about folks trying to understand themselves in relationship to the world with pride and with confidence and with wholeness. I think being stolen on stolen land is a way to acknowledge where we are, what land we resist on, and how to be accountable to that. You know, there is no Black liberation without Indigenous sovereignty. That like it's not actually possible for one thing to happen over another. They actually have to happen together. And if that is such, then we have to acknowledge all the ways that we are different, all the ways that we are the same, and how we come together to reshape a new future, reimagine differently with new possibilities. You know, that's when we talk about Afrofuturism through the work of Octavia Butler, or or Indigenous futurism, you know, or Afro-Indigenous futurism. However you dream yourself forward, we are already, I understand myself as already being science mission. You know, as a trans woman who is a leader of a Black movement, I'm already science fiction. I already am a person who has reshaped a mold that folks thought was impossible. And I think as bridge people, as people who live in between many in-betweens and intersections, that we have an opportunity to show the world more love, more nuance and expression and connectivity. And I think that that's what these bloodlines in me offer me. And so that's what I hope to offer in reciprocity to the world and the land itself.
Thank you so much.
Sorry. I also did not say where I was in the opening. I am in Takaranto, where the trees stand in the water, the one dish, one spoon treaty, home to like many peacekeeping systems and communities and peoples throughout millennia. And I just wanted to acknowledge that. I'm in Treaty 13 right now, performing this work on this land and trying to, I don't want to curse, decolonize. We're just going to say decolonize myself as someone who has been colonized, who has grown up with all these different ways that I assume are my natural responses, or just the way I am, or just the way the world is. And I have to question and question and question again and again and again. Which allows me to be more open to everyone's experience. And I'm really thankful for being able to share that with all of you today.
Thank you so much, Raven, for that. And Kristen, is there anything you'd like to add to this conversation of stolen people on stolen land and what that means to you?
Thank you. Yeah, I think Raven really summed up the great points there. And I think I did appreciate how Aja sort of mentioned earlier, her people aren't stolen. And I do have to say the same myself. My father's from Jamaica, not necessarily brought to Canada, but kind of came on his own will. But, maybe just a point when I wanted to speak on this panel, I really did think about some areas of, that intersectionality. And I think, I shared on my social media really about, as a Black and Indigenous person, when it comes to, the celebration of our country, even, Canada Day, my dad is very proud to be Canadian now and live in this country because, he wants to, live in the land of the free, I suppose. But as an Indigenous person, I think about the land that was, ripped away from my mom's ancestors and sort of how that came to be. So I think about stolen lands more so just from my perspective than stolen people. But I think about, what really caught my attention was what Raven's saying, who'd we be if we were uninterrupted? And I kind of just paused for a second and really reflected on that, because I think, as a Black and Indigenous person in both areas, who would we be if we were interrupted on both sides? And, it'd be very different, but I do appreciate that comment. And, as it relates to stolen people, I can't really provide too much context in that. And I do want to be clear. But in terms of stolen land, this idea of, owning land is so foreign to me. I still think about it now. I do own a house, but I'm kind of like, how did this come to be? And then I sort of trail off in thoughts about, different things that happened over history to be where we are today. And it's just not a natural way of being or living. But I guess that's all I have to comment on there, because I can't really go into too much detail about stolen people, because it's not my story to tell. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristen. And Tasha or Asia, is there anything that you'd like to add to that question?
I would just add that I think it's really, really important that we situate ourselves, no matter how we got to these Indigenous territories that we're in, that we acknowledge the ancestors of those places, right? And so, and with that acknowledge, it's more than an acknowledgement. There's a responsibility and an obligation under those, what we call Indigenous legal orders. So no matter how we got here, we have to come to that place of recognition that, and in similar fashion to what Raven was saying, right? There is a responsibility there, and it's up to each individual person to understand and learn about those natural laws and those responsibilities and those obligations, and what that entails. And I think, again, I also can't speak too much from the position of stolen people and stolen land, but for me, it really is about understanding what are the laws of the nation that you're situated in? What are those Indigenous legal orders? How are you to acknowledge the lands and waters? What are you supposed to be doing? How can you ensure, right, land is given back? How can you become that activator for those processes to occur, right? And again, I think as long as the colonialism doesn't want any of that to occur, right? And so the minute people start becoming more conscious of those responsibilities and those obligations, there's a shift, right? And so yeah, for me, it's about recognizing and learning, right? Decolonization means actively learning, but not from the perspective of non-Indigenous structures and educational institutes and societies, but from the perspectives of the people whose land you are now situated in as a guest, right? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tasha. And Asia, is there anything you'd like to add? We do have one question from the audience that I'd love to get to, but of course I want to give you the space to respond to this question if you'd like.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I really appreciate everything the other panelists have said. I can't really speak, any more than I really have. Like I said, as much as I'm not a stolen person, and neither is my father or his ancestors, I'm still here. And as Tasha said, like, it's my responsibility in decolonization to uphold that and uphold the territories that I'm on and the people that are here, and, in both the communities that I'm a part of, in the Black community, in the Indigenous community. But yeah, that's all I would say that I would like to add.
Thank you so much, Asia. So we have time for probably one or two questions from the audience. So I have a question here from Ricky Strapp. Colonial-led organizations like to jump on doing BIPOC programming, and I find that lateral violence shows up in power dynamics these organizations reinforce. How can we prepare and build solidarity while surviving in these spaces?
I think we need to create our own spaces. I think we need to move out of non-Indigenous institutions. I think we have to make an effort to finance our own spaces, right? Because it's about economics, it's about money. And now it's trendy, right? You can get tons of dollars, there's tons of money being kind of poured, well, not actually, and in the larger scale, it actually isn't very much money at all. It's very little money. But I think, part of that activation is funneling some of those finances into spaces that we do create that are inclusive. Imagine having our own kind of Black Indigenous center of excellence. Wouldn't that be phenomenal? right? Our own universities, our own educational systems, like that's what I'm about. I think if we're inside non-Indigenous institutions, there's going to be small pockets, but that's it. There's not going to be anything really tangibly created. So for me, it's about creating it for ourselves. And this is where that allyship and that solidarity can come forward, and do everything you can to promote that sovereignty, right? And filter and divert those funding, those dollars, right? Anyone who gets into those positions of power, ensure that you're diverting those actual the monies to Indigenous and Black and Black Indigenous organizations that are going to actually create that change.
I just want to say this before I jump off. I agree in terms of creating our own spaces, and when we're in those spaces, to have very deep conversations about how we don't perpetuate the same types of violence that we're trying to walk away from. And you do that by conversation, by honesty and transparency. You know, we are all capable of harm in this colonized state. We are all capable of love and grace. And so if we offer that with each other in whatever state or place we're in our journeys of learning, I think we open up for safer environments and spaces to be in. However, if you are in those spaces where you are trying to create diversity in places that hasn't had it, everyone actually is responsible for it. It can't just be one director and one person or one Black caucus or one Indigenous caucus. Everyone is responsible for safety. And so making sure that everyone who's a part of the organization or the company or the business or whatever you're a part of is actually a part of creating that safety, and what that looks like, even if you don't experience it. So many people believe that empathy is the only way to acknowledge people, but sometimes it's just witnessing, sometimes it's just listening, sometimes it's just self-reflection, because you can't create outside of you what you haven't done inside, you know? And that takes time to unlearn and all those kinds of things. But thank you for your question. It's really important. And I have to jump off, and I'm just sending lots of love to each and every one of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raven. And thank you all for your meaningful contributions. Unfortunately, we're out of time today. I would love to stay on Zoom all day and talk with you all, because I know there's a lot we could discuss, but unfortunately that's all the time we have for today. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who commented in the chat and is asking questions. And now I'll pass it over to Shayna for our outro. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And thank you very much, Raven, Kristen, Aja, and Tasha, for cultivating such a wonderful discussion. I sincerely hope that everyone enjoyed themselves. And thank you so much, Isaac, for moderating that discussion. As a reminder, keep an eye open for our follow-up survey and an opportunity to be entered for a chance to win a prize pack of items, which includes the caucus logo, which was designed by Raven Dubofsky. After a brief break, we'll be back with Art and Activism, Artivism and Social Change at 3 p.m. For more information on the Intersectional Caucus, please consult our website and stay tuned to our social media. I want to thank you again, and a big thank you for our sponsors, and I'll name them: Cambrian College, Canadian Mental Health Association, Sudbury Manitoulin, Centre de Santé Communautaire du Grand Sudbury, the Centre Victoria pour Femmes, Coalition to End Violence Against Women, Collège Boréal, Future North, Futur du Nord, Galerie du Nouvel Ontario, Greater Sudbury Public Library, Mental Health and Addictions Program of Health Sciences North, the Nickel Refillery, Public Health Sudbury and District, Radio Access Network, HIV, Hepatitis, Health and Social Services, Services Sociaux et de Santé pour l'Hépatite et le VIH, Sudbury Action Center for Youth, SASI, Sudbury Workers Education and Advocacy Center, SWEAC, and YWCA Sudbury. In the spirit of the conference theme, Amplifying Voices on Turtle Island, stay loud, stay proud, our voices will be heard. Thank you for joining us, and have a splendid rest of the day.